This series of videos introduces the 38 chapters of the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. It's a project of the Social Change Lab, and we gratefully acknowledge the support of the Mary Lee bequest for the work of our team.
Hi, everyone. This is Winifred Lewis, a professor in psychology at the University of Queensland.
Sara Westergren, a lecturer in social psychology at Keele University in the UK.
Hello, I'm Zach, and I'm a student studying at UQ, studying psychology.
And we're all here in part 2 of our discussion of chapter 33 on biographical consequences of environmental activism. And one of the authors of that chapter is here, Dr. Sara Westergren. And Sarah's been talking to us about the chapter, and we're really just opening a new conversation about how we can use this content in the environmental movement and in other movements. Sarah, why don't you just start on that great topic?
Yeah, thank you. So we've kind of focused more on narrow individual campaigns and individual changes. Obviously, it's all related to the social and social identity and a theory of the self. But what we're trying to take this forward with, of course, because we're in a climate crisis. I mean, not looking particularly good.
No.
So we need to, whatever we can chip in with, we need to chip in with, right? So focusing on environmental campaigns and environmental protests and activism, we know that there's lots of pro-environmental values and behaviors that are attached to these biographical consequences or these psychological changes. So for example, if you identify more as an environmentalist, you're more likely to recycle properly. You're more likely to make environmental choices. So maybe you don't take your car to the shop. Maybe you jump on your bicycle, or maybe you buy an avocado that's traveled by boat rather than plane. All of those kind of choices. So of course, if we can get these changes to sustain, so people keep this behavior up by also keeping up their understanding of themselves as environmental activists, then we can probably have a societal effect.
Yep.
For example, and also to do that, we need people to identify more as environmentalists. And that, of course, has to do with networks and opportunities to identify. And I mean, Winifred, you've done lots of stuff on social networks and the effect of social networks on sustain.
I appreciate it in the chapter when you talk briefly about that work, which I'm so interested in. It's just the way that one activist identity can sustain another, and how having multiple friends who, let's say, care about the environment can help you to sustain your commitment over time. I just think that's a really important message in all areas of life, that you can choose with intentionality how you connect with different groups and people. And one of the factors would be to try and support yourself and others to move in those directions over time. I wonder how that sounds to someone like Zach, though, because it's almost like you've got to join not just one environmental group, but 5. I mean, does that sound appealing?
It sounds appealing. So previously, from what I learned, there was this this thing called CIMIC. So it stands for Social Identity Management of Identity Change.
Yeah.
So it basically mentions that if you belong in multiple groups, then you can also gain greater adjustment and well-being.
That's right.
Yeah, building a new identity. So if, let's say, you have identity as a social activist and you're surrounded by people who support you, you are more likely to gain self-efficacy, as mentioned in the chapter.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's good. That's a good thing.
I love that you brought up that great work by Alex Haslam and others, the CIMIC model. It's so relevant as well to that work that you mentioned, Sarah. One question or thought that I have is that sometimes there's a tension between wanting everyone to be an environmentalist and wanting all sorts of other groups that might reject that environmentalist label to also have environmentally friendly norms. So, we want everyone to recycle. And sometimes if we say that only environmentalists recycle, then that could mean that people that don't have a positive view of environmentalists don't recycle. And the reality is sometimes, we've got to let go of owning a behavior for it to truly reach the whole social world. And I've been very interested in that lately, trying to think about the multiple group universe. This kind of connects in with your chapter when you're talking about those broad networks. The idea that we can consider, if I have, let's say, 2 environmental group networks, but 2 conservative group networks, here in Australia and in the UK to some extent, there isn't a bipartisan support for the environment, so frustrating. In Europe and in many other places in the world, that's not the case. So we can think, how can we persuade a broader society to take up those norms? And is it the case that if I, in fact, try to manage my networks and be part of multiple groups, that will happen, that positive norm change could happen, even if the identity doesn't spread? It's quite contradictory from a social identity perspective to think of norms spreading without identities, but I do think that there is some evidence that can occur. So we have to think about why. And I think part of it is, in a way, when one oppositional social identity dynamic, like, for example, environmentalist conservative or environmentalist farmer, is transcended by a new frame. And I think that's one of the aspects of the book that I've really enjoyed, is diving deep into the sociological and political science work on frames, where we can construct or relate the norm to another identity, making it more concrete. Like, I think many viewers might have heard of the Martin Luther King's speech, I Have a Dream, where he really linked the idea of racial equality to the American identity. It was an act of what Steve Reicher and others called identity entrepreneurship. It's like, I'm going to define the identity in a fresh way. So if I'm an environmentalist, I'm not just going to spread the environmental identity and norms as a discrete entity that I want everyone to take on. I'm going to go in and explain why being an academic is embracing the idea of sustainability, and why being a member of my church is going to be embracing the idea of sustainability. And that's very understudied, I think, as an aspect of the environmental movement, this kind of evangelism of the norm.
Yeah, and I think you touch upon loads of really interesting stuff there. So, I mean, of course, first of all, we quite lazily just talk about environmentalism, right? As it's one thing, as it's one frame fits all. But I mean, for example, Extinction Rebellion suffered a lot from this. So they were seen as just this one thing, and just following, the ideas of Roger Hallam. And that didn't fit people, especially younger people couldn't really identify with that. They didn't identify with the types of actions that they wanted to push. So they started to create lots of subgroups, which meant that, of course, more people had opportunities to identify. And you don't have to be in XR to be an environmentalist. Fridays, that's another way to identify. Or you don't even need to identify with the group. You can identify broadly with, pro-environmentalism. So I think in relation to network size, that also gives you more opportunities to identify as. So the more people that identify with, the greater the chance that you will identify with some of that. But relatedly to us being slightly narrow-minded and seeing it as almost binary, so you're either environmentalist or you're not.
Yeah.
And related to the various, how we want norms to be in various identities, we also need to touch upon intersectionality, right?
Yeah.
So, I'm.
Do you want to define that? Yeah, sorry. I'm sure.
Yeah. So when if I take myself as an example, so I'm an environmentalist. I'm also a woman, kind of a feminist. As you can see on my T-shirt as well, it says "This is my body."
Okay. I can't read your T-shirt.
In the context of the US. But I'm also an immigrant, right? So I have all of these identities that intersect, that are all important to me, that all have values and norms that I kind of obliged to, that I live by. And I think we often forget about that. So it's, you know, how can I be a woman and an environmentalist at the same time?
Mm.
How can I be, you know, how can you be a Black man and an environmentalist?
Yeah.
Or a Black woman? So I think there's all of these different identities coming into one, and there's not a lot of work done in relation to that yet. And I think that's a really exciting step forward. How can we understand the intersectionality of identity and how that affects, you know, values, norms, behaviors?
Couldn't agree more. Zach, what do you reckon about all this? Do you have any thoughts or questions that are coming to you at this time?
Just now when you were mentioning about being a woman and being an environmentalist, and then being a Black man and being an environmentalist. So I was like also very curious about the interaction effects, about the different types of identities you have. What if your identities that you have contradict one another?
Mm.
Yes. So how would it impact you as a human or as a person?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm a kind of hardcore social psychologist. I sometimes pretend that I'm also a political and environmental psychologist. But for me, it's about the social context always. So even though all of these identities intersect, one of them will, in the way I'm thinking at the moment, one of them will always be slightly more salient, depending on who else I perceive to be in the room, right? So sometimes, you know, I will focus more on maybe the veganism part of being an environmentalist. You don't have to be vegan, you know, to be an environmentalist, but or in other contexts, if I'm in a room full of only men, for example, then my woman part might be more salient rather than, you know, me starting to discuss, you know, whether or not I drink cow's milk. So I think
that's interesting. I mean, I think like if I think of the literature, one part is that having contradictory identities can actually be psychologically aversive. Like that same Simic model that you talked about, Zach, they show that if you have contradicting identities, it can make your well-being suffer. And I think what Sarah's talking about is that, you know, sometimes one identity is more salient at a time, and it's almost like I don't experience a contradiction because I'm a woman with my woman friends and environmentalist with my environmental friends, and I don't really experience the conflict. But what we talked about earlier, when you're in relationships where politics are debated and divisive and it's an issue, then people sometimes do drop out of movements. In my own network data, in that same study, I showed how if you were part of groups that were what could be interpreted as in contradiction, like being affiliated with a conservative party, but also being a peace activist, you are more likely to drop out of the peace movement after Australia went to war, led by the Conservative Party. So the way that I interpret that is, you know, before that happened, they were able to be peace activists and conservatives together. And after that, there was a tension, and maybe some of them became peace activists and angry with their party, and other people said, okay, well, you know, I'm going to drop out. What do you think, Sarah? Have you thought about those kinds of dynamics?
Yeah, and I think also, it's kind of related to the identity, right? Because so I'm a super privileged identity person, Scandinavian, white, academic. But I think it also so a lot of my identities aren't suppressed.
Do you mean you can always be yourself? There's no expectation. You have to self-censor.
Yeah, and also if there are other identities. So, for example, being Black might not always have this positive feeling with it. You might end up in a situation where your ethnic identity is super salient, but in a negative way. Yeah. So that you feel minoritized, and you know, because of course there's also lots of models of the relationship between prejudice and well-being, and you know, mediated by identity and so forth. So I think that is also in you know, needs to be taken into account just as you were just talking about, I think we need to also what comes with this identity. In some contexts, this identity makes us feel super proud, but in some contexts, this identity feels us, just beats us down.
Yeah, and I think other people have a lot, they mediate that, as you talked about earlier in part 1 of this chapter discussion. There's the intergroup aspect and the intra-group aspect. So when you've got those contradictory identities, like if your family is hassling you, or, if people are saying, well, you go to the environmental movement and no one's like you there, like they're not from your social background, or they're not, there's all men and you're a woman, or vice versa. I feel like it matters how the language is discussed at that point. Like even if there's just one other woman there and you're in a room with all the guys, you can kind of be a bit more relaxed than if you're on your own. So you can have that solidarity and support. And also if the men in that context are welcoming, then the dynamic and tension don't necessarily unfold. So it could be that there's a broader narrative that, the environmental movement is, super, it's probably the narrative that goes the other way, super dominated by women and unwelcoming to men. But if the context has a narrative that's positive and inclusive, then you can, like you said earlier, Sarah, construct the specific intersectional identity, which is positive. So, even if there isn't a tradition of international students being environmentalists at UQ, which actually there is probably. Our international student bodies are incredibly active and diverse, but then if the group is welcoming, you can kind of make a local norm. I think that's my perception of how those conflicts get managed. But if everyone's hostile and unwelcoming, and then you're in that environment, I do think there's often an either or, where people feel pushed out of the context, or they choose to leave because they don't feel they can be themselves. It comes back to that question of power and privilege that you raised, Sarah, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And so it's quite interesting. So we're doing, based on this work of biographical consequences and psychological change, we're going more deeper into some of these areas. So we're doing quite a lot of work on veganism at the moment. So how people understand veganism. I mean, there's lots of examples of being an environmentalist and going home for Christmas. So you'll arrive like a day later than everyone else because you refuse to fly, right? So you take the train. And then there's this whole Christmas table set and you don't eat any of it. So you're going to get loads of backlash from the family because you'll be the only one arriving late, and you'll be the only one, moaning about the food and stuff. So of course, in that context, it might be more difficult to keep it up.
Yeah.
Keep that identity up. And of course, also there's different layers of veganism. So you have some that are more maybe animal rights focused, and they would never buy secondhand leather, for example. So if they buy a pair of boots, maybe they'll go for PVC. But then you have the environmental vegans that are more, have the environmental part more salient. They'll probably rather buy secondhand pair of leather boots than PVC. So I think there's also different levels. So it's really, I think what my point is that it's so bloody complex, all of it, but it's also so exciting and interesting.
Yeah.
It's not just like,
I'm trying to work out if everyone needs to be told what PVC is, and I just thought I'd mention that it's that shiny plastic that people make boots of, just in case not everyone knows that. Yeah.
Thank you. Apologies for the lazy.
Well, I was just trying. I think everyone knows, but maybe not everyone knows. Anyways.
Now they.
Yeah. As we come to close this second part of the discussion, Sarah, is there anything else that you wanted to say before we go?
Well, I'll just say what I always say, protest is really good for you, so keep it up.
Well said. I don't think I could top that, so maybe we'll finish there. And I'll just say again, thank you, Sarah and Zach, for coming along today, and thank you to our viewers who are with us. Bye now.
Bye.
For those of you watching, be sure to subscribe and follow us at Social Change UQ, and check out our website for more videos.